Things to do, go off boat, see this battlefield, see this town, see whatever, and come back, or not go. If you didn't want to go, there was no pressure to go. You could stay on the boat and read.
And are you just like cruising down where you have windows and you're looking out?
No, balconies.
We had balconies, they had a little bit.
Probably
A little bit wider than yours.
Yes, I would take it. Driver's license.
Yeah, and
No, you
there's,
put money in.
it's
Well,
just
I've never
everything
been
you
to
could
this.
ask. We found 5,500 per person. But just wonderful. And they have longer ones.
Yes.
Ours was 8 or 9 days, but they do have, you can do the whole Mississippi. So we just did the lower. And you have to fly there yourself. They don't provide airfares. So, we saw barges going by, and bridges that would go over at night, and,
It was really kind of neat. There's just there's no, there are many places that are similar to a big lake.
I will get together with you. I'll show you.
Different age groups. Did I tell you who it was?
Six. It is 6, isn't it?
Yep.
Give us her life history. She's got 3 kids. One's graduated. One's in seminary. She's good. She's a right. I knew you should have.
Over there.
That I have more in mine. I don't know. Mine will never. So it's amazing. Size 3 then.
Good seeing you.
I can move far enough for you to sit on it.
It's good. I like the armrest.
Okay, he likes the armrest, so we're good. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
She'll be there.
We want to be able to see better. Dottie, check it out.
There's the one in the blue and white shirt. Do
Okay.
not ask me to repeat that later.
No, okay, but
Weekend was better.
but from where? From which side of the mountain?
She must be from over here.
From
From here.
when? Oh, from here. Okay.
I think so.
Okay.
Right? Don't you go tomorrow?
I'll ask Barbara Cook.
Might want to kill those lights that are shining right on the screen.
Can you kill those lights?
She just has to turn him off. She doesn't have to kill him.
Better? Oh, better.
Not really good.
Long night from Senator. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening,
We
Kim.
sometimes have people, enter. So, you hear the door open. That's probably new guests. Welcome to our June program. We're excited today to be hosting Dee Dee Thorpe, who is the Town of Hunter historian. And over the past, year, we've learned about some connective tissues between our community. And the story of the Twilight Fire is one of those that connects Conesville and Haines Falls. So we're really excited to have you. Thank you for coming. We're gonna have a quick membership meeting afterwards. We have a few items to go over relating to upcoming events. You're more than welcome to stay. You're also encouraged to have a drink and have a snack at some point during or even after the program. So welcome, Dee Dee.
Thanks a lot. And along with those connective tissues, we also found Kim's brother, Doug, worked with me me over at Kern's Nursery for umpteen years after I retired, so that was a connection that I really liked. But anyway, yes, can you hear me okay?
Oh, yeah.
Good.
I'm Dee Dee Turnsthorpe, the town hunter historian, your neighbor to the east. And I really am very appreciative, Kim, of dragging me over here. I'm honored to present this to the community where Carl Stryker, we'll talk a lot tonight about Carl Stryker, the young man that saved so many people in the Twilight Empire, was from the Collinsville, Gilboa area. So this means a lot to me. Before I start presenting the Unifier or Carl Stryker, I'd like to talk a little bit about my personal importance to this subject. My dad was a New York City fireman for 30 years. He was brought up in Haynes Falls. He was 16 when the Twilight Inn burned. And he and his brother went up to the Twilight Inn the next day, and Dad always told me he never forgot the smell of burning flesh. And that's exactly what they saw. And I always attribute that to the reason that he became a New York City fireman. But anyway, let me explain how the park began. First of all, we were fortunate over on our side of the mountain because we had 5 parks that started in the late 1800s. All of them started within 3 years. And this gentleman named Wingate, he was a sanitary engineer. He had a conference to go to up at Hotel Catterskill. So he went there, and then after a couple of days when the conference was over, they moved down below to the Haynes Falls house and stayed there for a few days and loved, it was owned by a man named Charles Haynes. And he loved the property across from it, which he said, you know, how much do you want for that property? What is it? And he said, oh, it's just an old sheep pasture. So $10 an acre. So he bought 160 acres. But Charlie Haynes was called Christian Charlie Haynes. Self-explanatory, I guess. But anyway, Charlie Haynes gave 3 reasons that...
Hold that away from me a little further.
Okay. All right, like that?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. 3 stipulations. One, that there had to be a bridge built across the waterfalls, the falls, at Haynes Falls. And 1, that there had to be at least 5 cabins built that year, or within the year, or the money had to be rescinded. The other one is that there never could be alcohol sold in Twilight Park, which to this day, 140 some years, it's probably indulged in, but it's not sold in Twilight. That's it. The other thing is, I wanted to explain where Twilight Park actually is for the people that don't know. When you get off the thruway in Catskill or Kingston, you're going to look for Route 23A, which takes you, of course, right over here to Prattsville almost. But so when you drive up the Clove Road or Justine Hollow Highway, which has been recently named from the past historian, there's 2 stone pillars on the left-hand side. That is the Wingate entrance into Twilight Park. Twilight Park, which started with 160 acres, now has 560, I believe, and 91 homes. So it's fairly large. Okay, so yes, I started telling you there was Onteora in Townersville, there was Elka Park in Elka Park, and there were 3 parks in Haynes Falls. There was Santa Cruz Park, Sunset Park, and Twilight Park, all located within about a mile of each other. So that did a lot for the business. First of all, the Catskill Mountain House, Hotel Catterskill, and Laurel House were already built, so they were bringing in business. And then the railroads came. And then it was just after that, 5 years or so, when the parks came in. So that took the few little businesses that were in Haynes Falls, and we had tons of businesses. We had lumber yards and coal businesses. We had ladies' dress stores. We had hairdressers and barbershops and pharmacies. Today we have a post office and luckily a Stewart's ice cream. But anyway, and the parks brought a lot of work to the community, which they still have. The contractors are constantly called in to do work in the parks because the buildings are 100 years old. So it's constant renovations. But it also brought in jobs for nannies, for house cleaners, for landscapers, for waitresses, and many other domestic positions. The money isn't quite the same today as it was 140 years ago, but it's still supplying quite a bit of work. Yeah, so I'll just run this by you. We had lumber yards, a coal yard, 2 groceries, a meat market, pharmacies, a barber shop, beauty parlors, ladies' dress shops, 2 railroads, plus we had the 2 railroads, plus we had Otis Railway, which went from Helenville down up to the Catskill Mountain House. But within 6 years of the 1895, when Tynersville became incorporated, when the town of Hunter became incorporated, the village of Tynersville became incorporated. Within 6 years, we had 2 volunteer fire companies that had already started with a total of 106 firemen. And for a siren, they used a metal ring, and they would hit that, and vibrations would set off a gong loud enough that the churches and the schools, if they heard it, they would also set off their gongs. And when I went to the Strykerville presentation in Gilboa, they actually had one of those rings. So, but I'm going to just show you a few pictures that I have on here, just to give you an idea of the scope of how big Twilight Inn was. And Twilight Inn, the park opened in 1887. It was incorporated in 1888. Twilight Inn the first Twilight Inn was built before 1889. So you could tell that how many carpenters were working on these buildings. And then it was called the clubhouse, or the community house. Charles Wingate believed it or not, ladies, that women should have a real vacation, so they shouldn't have a kitchen in their house. So they could eat dinner over at the community center, which was really, he was ahead of his time. Sorry.
Should be able to just click the arrows. On a keyboard.
Oh. Sorry.
There you go.
Okay, this is just Twilight Park was named for a club in New York called the Twilight Club. And Wingate was very involved with the Twilight Club. And it sounds like a pretty cool club because there were no meetings, there were no dues, there was no president, they didn't do anything except get together and have dinner and converse. So that's what it was named for. But this is the Haynes Falls house, which stood right at the top of the mountain road, and that's where Charles Wingate stayed for a couple of days when he was actually purchasing Twilight Park. That is what was the sheep pasture. That is Twilight Park. And that was what sold for $10 an acre. Those are the men that are building the bridge across the top of Haynes Falls. And you know, from being in the Historical Society, I'm amazed at the amount of people that actually know about Haynes Falls and they want to go to the actual falls. But that is private property. That all belongs to Twilight Park. Probably something you could never get away with today. This was Twilight Park. This was the inn. This was the community center, the club, where they had dinners. This was the first one that was built in 1888, 1889, that area. And that's it. You can check out the staircases. People must have been in very good shape back then. And that's another one. The creek and the staircase is still there leading up to that. That's just another picture of the Twilight Inn. That's the Twilight symbol is the moon and the owl. And that just shows you how little trees there were around back then. The tanneries had really wiped a lot of trees out. And that's a good picture of Twilight Park. And you can see the water down below on the left and the bridge. Okay, this is the Twilight Inn. This was at first it was the community building. Then they renovated it in 1897. They named it the Twilight Rest. Then in 1907 they renovated it again and they named it Twilight Inn. It was $5 a day to stay there. But that's what it looked like. It was a beautiful building. That to the right is the annex. That's still standing today. But that's a massive building. And you have to understand, these buildings were built like on ledges. So it's just the contractors that did these jobs were amazing. That's the contractors. That gives you an idea how many men were working on the building. That's within the first 10 years, Twilight Park had 2 churches built. This one's still in very good condition. That's the clubhouse for anyone that hasn't been there. And for anyone that is artistically inclined, the Twilight Park holds an art show every year in August. And it's a fantastic art show. So if anyone wants the website or whatever, they can just go on and Google Twilight Park. But it's open to everybody, and it's a wonderful art show for photography and art. One more picture, and then that's probably the last one. This was some pictures of the interior of the Twilight Inn. Very simple. You can see the men up on the top of the building. And this I kept in there just because if you drove on 23A, you would be right around where those pink flowers are, in front of the Historical Society building, and you look directly across at the Clove. Across the Clove, you would see Twilight Inn, and just to give you an idea how far that was from Sunset Inn, that's the Sunset Inn in the back on the right. It's just an image. Unfortunately, they only had 2 fire escapes in Twilight Inn. Both of them were wooden. Sorry, Christine. This is the same tape. Okay, these 3 chimneys, this is a pretty bad scene. This is after the fire happened. The fire was very rapid. It was an old building, or it was a wooden building, balloon framed. And would you explain balloon framing for me?
Yeah, that's where there were no stops on the outside wall. Today in construction, they put stops in at every floor and stuff like that. Back in those days, there was nothing. And what would happen, the fire would get in the outside walls and zoom right all the way to the top. And they learned a lot, their department had over the years. Back then, they didn't do it.
Yeah, it was a fast fire. In fact, we have to remember too that this was 98 years ago. So this was when smoking regulations were nil. OSHA took another 53 years to get here. Usually the safety requirements were after a tragedy happened. And unfortunately, this was one of those. I'll try and stage the night. It was 1 o'clock in the morning when Carl Stryker heard something, and he went down the basement. The fire was full-fledged. It was out of control by that time. The employees of the Twilight Inn and the area had a party the night before, so there was dancing and good times had. And by that time, but they broke up at midnight. They all went up to bed. But Carl Stryker, I mean, this kid, he was 25 years of age. He had only worked at the inn for 10 days. So that commitment that you usually feel with homes, with your job is really there after 10 days, but he was. He ran up and down the halls on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd floor, knocking on the door and yelling, get up, fire, jump out of the windows, get down. And thank God it was midweek, because if it had been on the weekend, it would have been a real tragedy, more of a tragedy, because it housed about 275 to 300 rooms. The cause was never determined. Whether it was a discarded cigarette or a boiler spark, nobody will ever know. But when here's a blurb from a New York Times 1926 fire. This was the next day. The hallways of the 22nd and 3rd floors were filled with screaming guests, awakened from sleep and disorientated, running back and forth through the halls. A woman awoke hearing the words, "Fire, fire, jump, jump." She picked up her 6-year-old son and threw him out a window, and thank God one of the firemen caught him. But then she jumped. She was badly injured, but she survived. And then there's the matter of it was a very dry time of the year, so the water situation was very low, and they didn't have, of course, hydrants there. The water they did have, they couldn't control the fire, but they could control anything else burning. They did lose one house in Twilight from it, but other than that, they didn't. And then they had the awful task of identifying the bodies, and there were, you'll see them up here. There's the fire truck, which had to go down to the waterfalls at the top of the mountain, so all this stuff took time. The 3 chimneys. You see the baby there? There's a baby on there.
How many people died?
23. A lot of them were the staff, because the staff slept on the 3rd floor.
How many got out?
Well, there was a total of 48, so half of them. And there were a lot of injuries. I mean, it had to be tragic. They said it was absolutely tragic for the people that lived in Twilight Park, because let's face it, Mountaintop never handled anything like this.
Tell them about the tombstone in Haynes Falls.
Well, we have a picture of it.
Oh, have you got it?
We believe these were park people, just by the way they were dressed. These are some local people that came out. It was, when I researched, I found newspapers from all across the country because it was a large amount. I said 23, there was between 23 and 26 people that died. Here's the headstone that's behind the Methodist Church in Haynes Falls. And the way this all started was the Historical Society had us do a walkthrough of the Haynes Falls Cemetery. And a lot of people had seen this large headstone, but you just don't pay attention to everything that's written on a headstone. So that day, the attention of people was really brought to a head. And people were really interested in the Twilight Empire, so Joanna Ainsworth and I, a board member, decided to do this presentation on the Twilight Empire. And there were many people that lived in Twilight right this summer that had no idea of the tragedy that happened at the Twilight Inn. And one of the big hindrances for the firemen was when the fire started and when the fire trucks got to Haynes Falls from Tannersville, because at that time there was no Haynes Falls Fire Company, it was too early, they hadn't formed yet. So when the Tannersville Fire Company got up to Twilight Park, the bridge was being replaced. Again, this was pre-OSHA, safety rules just weren't taken into consideration. So they drove all the way down a 1/4 mile road to the fire and realized they couldn't turn around because there was no way to turn around, so they had to back out to the main road. So any fire trucks that came up from Palenville or Catskill to help also found that same tragedy. They had to back out. So it was quite a, the guests that did get out, they were injured very badly. Some of them stayed in all the local hotels. I'll name a few of them, but it doesn't. The Loxhurst, which is where the Historical Society is now. Twilight Cottagers put up a lot of people. The Bear and Fox Inn in Onora Park put people up. And the medical facilities were very limited. I mean, Townsville had a small Red Cross hospital with 7 beds, so they utilized those. And that building, by the way, was donated by Onora Park. A mother escaped with her 2 daughters, but then watched while the floor gave way and one of her daughters fell into the fire. The chef's wife, the cook there, his wife had gotten out, but she couldn't find her husband. Remember, it's 1 o'clock in the morning, it's cold, the fire's intense. She couldn't find her husband. She went back into the building to find him. He had been outside. She didn't make it out. Another woman, she had badly burned eyes. She was brought directly into one of the cottagers' houses so that they could cover her eyes with dark cloths and in a dark room. And then a sad story. Next time I come, I promise it'll be a happy story. But the 15-year-old girl, her sister worked at Twilight Inn as a chambermaid and didn't like the job. So unbeknownst to anyone, her sister left the job and her younger sister came in. And that was her first night at work. And unfortunately, her father heard her name being announced on the radio and went to them and said, "My daughter doesn't work for you." And no, he just didn't know it. So they did identify her ring. But Twilight Park, the church that we showed, they had services the next day, and I'm sure it was to start the healing process for the park people because it was pretty traumatic. The Catholic and the Methodist church, they both had a service within a week. The funeral, they said, the day the funeral took place in Haynes Falls, there were over 300 people at the funeral. The headstone, which Ed mentioned, which is right here, names the 14 people that were unidentified. They were put into 4 caskets and they were buried right behind the church. Hudson France was the son of Ed France, who was the park superintendent. When he spotted the fire, he got a hold of Hudson France, who called the fire company, and that's when Carl went running through the hotel. The New York City Police Camp, for anyone that doesn't know, when you get to Platte Cove, which is like 5 miles from Tannersville, heading south, the police camp had just been opened, and the police camp was opened in 1920 or 21, and it was really a haven for any injured police officer and their families to vacation for 2 weeks, and it was massive. It ended up lasting from about 1920 to right through till 1980. So it did well for many years and supplied half the mountain with work, I can say that. It was the 6th fire in that hotel, and that just amazes me. After the 1925 fire, which had been the 4th fire, George Wingate called the insurance company to find out why there were so many fires happening, but there were no safety issues brought to his attention. The 5th fire was on the opening day that season in 1926, just a month before the fatal fire. And yet no blame was ever declared on the big gates or the Twilight Association. I'm going to name these bodies, the people, because I just feel like I should owe it to them. It was 14 of them. And I have to tell you that when we did the presentation in Twilight Park, a woman happened to say while we were setting up chairs that there were 3 people there from the city that had come up because they had lost relatives back in 1926. If it hadn't been for that, I never would have said, if anyone here is connected to any of the people that died in the fire, please let us know and speak up after the presentation. And they did, and it was wonderful. And it was a chambermaid, a waitress, and the woman's grandson who came up here for allergies. So it was a pretty tragic fire, but it was Herbert Beardsley and his mother Henrietta, Charlotte Brinton, Herman Angle and his wife Adelaide, Mary Erling, the chef's wife, Julia Hennessy, Annie Milbank, Ernest Potsky, Isabel Chapman Brooks, she was one of the women, Florence Chapman Monroe, she was also one of the women, and then little Billy DeMarco, he was the grandson, Carl Stryker from here in Collinsville, and Kate Thomas. And there was a few heroes I'd like to mention. Hannah Hyatt, she was an employee who knew of a hidden trap door and forced it open to save about a dozen people. She was the last in line. She was hurt badly, but she survived. And then there were a few local men that came and assisted the firemen. The next person is Carl Stryker, that young man that I've been researching for a few years. He was the night watchman. His young life ended that night. I'd like to think of today as a tribute to Carl, whose real name I believe was Carl Stryker. He had only worked at the inn for 10 days when the fire happened. He made numerous trips in and out helping guests and staff. One of his co-workers, Walter Smith from Haleville, grabbed his arm and tried to get him to stop, didn't want him to go back into the fire again. He went in, he loosened his arm and went in. He never made it out. He was said to be 25, had just buried his father the year before, leaving his mother with 2 daughters. Her name was Catherine Baldwin. She was also from the Coatesville, Gilboa area. And hopefully today puts a closure to Carl Stryker's life. So, thank you very much, guys. The rest of these photos, that was the monument, and that was sponsored by Twilight Park. And those are the 4 cornerstones that they used to put on their sites. And that's that. So, thank you for coming. Thank you for listening to this.
Thank you.
Any questions?
You guys have relatives there? From the Coatesville area?
Can I ask, is there a connection, how is Carl Stryker connected with the strikers from this area?
He's from this area.
You don't know where the connect?
Well, his father was Fernando, and his mom was a Baldwin. All I found in the old papers was that he died the year before, young. He was very young too. And then mom raised the
Yeah, just because I know there's been a lot of strikers.
So, yeah, so that was one of the questions that we've looked into. It appears that they lived in Conesville, probably up Durham Road, like near the state forest for a while. And then, if you follow the newspaper stories, it looks like the family moved to Ashland, and then somehow Carl made his way to the Twilight Inn fire. In the newspaper articles, they aren't necessarily connected to anybody else, neither is Fernando mentioned anymore, because when the Gilboa Museum sponsored Clover Archer to do that kind of Stryker research project, she also, yeah, it never came up in her work either, but
I was just curious.
it's probably connected, just,
Like, what about like the census records? You probably see that he's a cousin to the people.
we
that
looked
live
at
there now.
those, they were only in Conesville for a short time during like his childhood.
They worked at the Pratt farm in Ashland. Pratt is pretty big.
Which farm?
Pratt. P-R-O-U-T. Yeah, I actually, that's how I met Kim, and I actually called over here to find out more about Carl Stryker. Because to me, it just amazed me that a 25-year-old man had a 10-day history on a job would put his life in jeopardy and lose it. Thanks, guys.
Anybody relatives of the strikers? Any of them still here?
Oh, there's a lot of
Yeah,
yeah, there's a lot of strikers, but
Yeah. And that became a cidery.
Well, so who was his father?
Fernando.
Fernando.
So what happened to Fernando? Do we know?
They
died.
moved to Ashland, he died, so.
Because I wonder, like, if we could trace him and see, you know, going back to some kind of record.
We attempted.
Yeah, nothing.
A group of us attempted from
Yeah,
Prattsville Town Historian, I tried, like we all pulled all of our resources together.
yeah. Sometimes that happens, you know, there's just nothing to look at, yeah.
A lot of papers were lost.
Sure.
During fires. But anyway, I've just always been, since I've known about that fire, it was one of the most, I believe it's still the largest big accident. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Did you try looking through the Mormon ancestry records, the
Yeah.
familyresearch.com?
Yeah. We tried that one, we tried all of the they're not.
I just don't do it.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of strikers in this particular part of town. They tend to be all in West Owensville, so they get the fact that we lived in completely different places.
I wonder if they know.
Oh,
Do you know of any brothers or sisters?
There were sisters.
No brothers, do we know?
Not that we know.
So I would imagine that if his father had brothers, that you know, they were, those families that came from that line could be the people here today.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, the Stryker family tree is gigantic.
Yeah.
But usually you can find,
Somebody.
in the Stryker family history, you can find a name. This one is very difficult to find.
And it's odd too, a name like Fernando Stryker, that's unique. So, one of those mysteries that's opposite.
To the newspaper.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying. Where was it located?
It's in Ashland, Pratt Farm.
Do you have any idea where though?
I don't, I think Carolyn Bennett might actually know where that one was. I'm trying to think if I think I have a newspaper article somewhere.
It was the Catskill Mountains.
we go out of here, we just stay straight past Westwood Road.
I know. That's what I said to them.
Yeah, I'm trying to think.
No, it's just go across the dam and it connects the bridge.
Okay, so the Gilboa Monitor
So yeah, that's
in
easy.
1910.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right?
So his sisters are Julia and Maud, from what we can figure out. They have Julia, Maud, and Coral, which then becomes Carl, calling it Frank Bailey's. There's that quick article. 1910, same Stryker family, calling on somebody else.
The river was the oldest mountain.
They're connected to Cleveland.
Just pronounced now.
They're in the Tolls Hollow column.
And then
So the Tolls Hollow would be South Mountain. So
connected to Catskill. bottom
that
of
helps
Catskill.
geographically
Goes up to
kind of pin this. They visited the Clevelands. A former resident here now located at Ashland and accompanied by Manly Brink was a caller at Waldo Smith's this afternoon. Coral Stryker is employed at Hunter, where he has a position for the season with a large boarding house. That's in the Stanford, New York Reporter in 1923. So that's,
But he, I believe he worked at another hotel that isn't given.
it does not give anyone that one.
He only worked at the United States.
Yeah.
Is it relevant to today?
Not that we do. He's definitely, like, it's not like, there's definitely
I
roots in
need to get up
Colville.
even with a
Take
picture.
credit for it, Mayor.
Yes.
Anybody wants to grab a quick snack or anything?
Did you all bake those?
Nice to meet you. Good to see you.
I have questions. I don't know what it means.